All right, so you're ready to get into this. Strategic hiring.
Oh, absolutely. This is always a fascinating one to unpack.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, everyone's experienced it at some point, right?
Right.
Either been through the process yourself or on the other side of it, like making those decisions. But it always seems like there's way more going on than just what's on the surface. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And that's where I think this idea of intelligence behind it, the human aspect, as our source puts it, gets really interesting.
Right, exactly. It's like, you've got your job description, you've got your list of qualifications, but then what? Like, is that really all there is to it?
Mhm.
You know?
Well, if you were to just go by those official documents, you might think so. But the material we're looking at today paints a very different picture.
So let's dive in. Like, for our listeners who might be thinking, okay, strategic hiring, that's HR's job, right?
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, I think the first misconception to ditch is that this is purely an HR function. It's so much bigger than that.
Okay, so it's not just about sorting through resumes and conducting interviews.
Definitely not. I mean, those are parts of the process, sure, but it's almost like those are the visible tip of the iceberg. And what we're really interested in here is what's going on beneath the surface.
Right. Okay, so kind of like an intelligence operation then.
That's a great way to put it. Our source actually uses the analogy of an invisible chess game, that even before a position is formally open, there's already a strategic game unfolding.
Ooh, okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So it's less about finding the best candidate in some objective sense and more about what? Making the right move for the broader game.
Exactly. And that's where things get really fascinating because the right move might not always be what seems obvious on the surface. It's about understanding the power dynamics at play.
Right, like who are the key players? What are their agendas?
Exactly. It's about understanding who stands to gain, who might lose, who's forming alliances, and maybe even, who has some scores to settle.
Ooh, juicy. So this is starting to sound less like an HR process and more like I don't know, a political thriller or something.
Well, there's definitely an element of that, and it's something we see playing out in both the private and public sectors. Our source gives examples like ADP, EDF, Carrefour, even government appointments at Magnon. It's really a widespread phenomenon.
So help me understand this a little better. How would this invisible chess game actually play out in, say, a large corporation?
Sure. Imagine you have a CEO nearing retirement. The board might be split on potential successors. There could be a rising star within the company who's seen as a natural fit, but maybe they're a little too close to the current CEO, and some board members want a fresh perspective.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Huh?
So the hiring process becomes this battleground for these different factions to push their agendas.
Precisely. And then you might have the head of HR trying to navigate these competing interests, maybe even acting as a kind of a kingmaker, even though that's not their official role.
Right, because officially, they're just there to find the best candidate for the job, right?
Exactly. And the source uses this really striking phrase. They call it a silent choreography. It's like everyone is playing their part in this intricate dance, but not everyone is aware of the full choreography.
So how does someone trying to understand strategic hiring at this level even begin to decipher all this?
Well, that's where this concept of humint, or human intelligence, comes in. And this is really what sets apart a strategic hire from just filling a vacant position.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What makes human different from, I don't know, traditional recruiting methods?
Well, traditional recruiting is very focused on what we might call hard skills. Like, can the candidate do the job? Do they have the right qualifications? But Humint goes beyond that. It's about understanding the individual in the context of the broader organization, the system they'll be stepping into.
Right, so it's less about checking boxes on a resume and more about reading between the lines, kind of like a detective, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's where things like reading weak signals, understanding unspoken motivations, and even deciphering what the source calls the architecture of non-said things become crucial.
Wow, okay, the architecture of non-said things. That's pretty profound. Like, can you give me an example of what that might look like in practice?
Sure, imagine a company that's going through a major restructuring. Officially, they might be looking for someone with a strong track record in change management. But if you're looking at it through a human lens, you might ask, okay, but what kind of change are they really looking for? Are they looking for someone who can come in and shake things up, or do they want someone who can maintain stability and reassure stakeholders?
Right, so it's not just about the skills themselves, but the context in which those skills will be applied. It's about understanding the underlying motives.
Precisely. And that's why human experts are so valuable in these situations, because they can help organizations see beyond the surface and understand the true implications of their hiring decisions.
And I imagine this is even more important in the public sector where you have, political considerations, bureaucratic structures, all that added complexity.
Absolutely. And the source highlights some really interesting contrasts between the private and public sectors. For example, in the private sector, you might have more flexibility in terms of process, but also a higher degree of opacity. It's all about image, transformation, and immediate results.
Right. But behind that facade, there could be all sorts of power struggles going on.
Exactly. You might have a CEO who's looking for a loyalist, while the board is hoping for someone who can provide a counterbalance, and then HR is trying to find someone who won't set off any further internal conflicts.
So navigating that minefield, that's quite a challenge.
It is. And
Right.
then in the public sector, you have more formal procedures, but the real decision-making often happens behind the scenes. It's like this carefully staged performance, as the source puts it, mise en scène, where the outcome might already be predetermined.
Wow. So the interviews, the evaluations, it's almost like a formality in some cases.
In some cases, yes. But it's still important to understand the symbolism of it all, because even if the decision has been made, the choice of candidate still sends a signal.
Right. Like a message to the organization and the public about the direction they're heading.
Exactly. And that's what the source calls master geometry of perception. Like, think about it. Appointing a woman to a key leadership position that can signal modernity, diversity, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Right. Or bringing in someone with a military background that might signal a desire for tighter control, a more disciplined approach.
Exactly. So even seemingly minor details like a candidate's background or experience can be interpreted as part of a larger strategic message.
So to really excel at this level of strategic hiring, you need a deep understanding of these subtle dynamics.
You do, and that's why the source introduces this fascinating framework called the Grammar of Intelligence, which breaks down the key elements of a Humint approach.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these elements?
Well, the first is la terre, or earth. This is about understanding the landscape, the power structures, the key players, like who really holds the influence within the organization.
Okay, so like mapping out the organizational terrain. What's next?
Then you have le feu, or fire. This is about sensing the intensity of relationships, the underlying tensions, any potential conflicts brewing beneath the surface.
So like the emotional temperature of the organization.
Exactly. And then you have l'eau, or water, which represents the human flow, the intuitive understanding of the forces of attraction and repulsion between individuals. Like, who naturally gravitates towards whom? Who avoids whom?
Right, the unspoken dynamics, the kind of stuff you can't really capture on an org chart.
Exactly. And then there's l'air, or air, which is about strategic flexibility. This is about assessing a candidate's ability to navigate complexity, to adapt to unexpected challenges, to thrive in a dynamic environment.
Right, because in today's world, things change so quickly, you need someone who can handle the turbulence.
Absolutely. And finally, you have less space, or space, which involves understanding the broader context, the hidden timings, the interplay between visible and less visible levels of the organization. It's about seeing the big picture and how all the pieces fit together.
So it's not just about evaluating the individual candidate in isolation, but about understanding how they fit into this complex ecosystem.
Precisely. And the source emphasizes that these 5 elements are especially important in what they call déstructurés, or unstructured interviews, where you can really get a sense of the person beyond their rehearsed responses.
And I imagine this whole approach also ties into the idea of scenario planning, right? Like thinking through the potential consequences of a hire.
Absolutely. The source describes recruitment as a moving puzzle where every piece matters. And they pose some really thought-provoking questions for organizations to consider, like, what happens if this candidate succeeds too quickly? What if their arrival actually increases tensions?
Right, because sometimes, bringing in someone new, even if they're incredibly talented, can disrupt the existing balance.
Exactly. And then there's the question of what if they overshadow established figures? Or what if the organizational culture just rejects them outright?
So it's about anticipating these potential pitfalls, right?
It is. And the source argues that recruiting without considering these scenarios is like moving in fog. A human-informed approach allows you to see the road ahead more clearly and make more strategic choices.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. It really highlights how strategic hiring goes so much deeper than just skills and qualifications.
It really does. It's about understanding those hidden dynamics, the unspoken motivations, the complex web of relationships. It's about seeing the bigger picture and anticipating the ripple effects of your decisions.
And ultimately, it's about using that understanding to shape the future of the organization.
Exactly. It's about making choices that not only fill a vacancy, but also move the organization in a desired direction. And that requires a whole different level of intelligence and strategic thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in a world where we're constantly bombarded with data, it's those human elements, those nuances, that often make the biggest difference.
I completely agree. And it's those elements that Humint helps us decipher. It's about understanding the people, the relationships, the unspoken rules of the game.
So for our listeners out there who might be thinking about their own careers, or maybe they're involved in hiring decisions, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the key takeaway is this. Don't underestimate the importance of the human element. Pay attention to the signals, both overt and subtle. Try to understand the motivations and agendas at play. And don't be afraid to ask questions, even if they seem uncomfortable.
Right, because sometimes the most important information is the information that's not being explicitly stated.
Exactly. It's about reading between the lines, understanding the subtext, and using that insight to make truly strategic decisions.
Fantastic. Well, this has been incredibly insightful, and I think it gives us all a lot to think about the next time we encounter the world of strategic hiring, whether as a candidate or as someone making those critical decisions. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always enjoy these conversations.
Me too. All right, until next time, everyone, keep diving deep.